distinguished guests, distinguished ambassador, His Excellency, distinguished ambassador, distinguished rector, welcome to the third day of Smart Economic Planning and Industrial Policy Conference. Now, for the opening speech, I would like to invite His Excellency, Mr. Jean-Daniel Ruch, the Ambassador of Switzerland of Turkey, to the podium, sir.
Okay.
When you press this one, it goes one by one.
Good. Good. Good. This is to announce that I'm going to speak, probably. Okay. Well, thank you for being here. I mean, after 2 days of seminars, you must be you must be exhausted. Like the industry in Western Europe, according to what many people think and say. We hear a lot about deindustrialization in Western Europe and in the US, and about the need to reindustrialize. I think we should speak also and focus more on the examples of European countries, Western European countries, that managed to maintain a strong industrial base. And why they managed to do that despite high salaries, high costs of living, and fierce competition, especially from Asia. So let's try to dive into the matter. Doesn't work. Okay, so as you can see from this graph, this represents the evolution of industry in various European countries over 20 years, roughly between 2000 and 2020. The black column represents evolution of productivity. The red column represents the value added by the industry. So the second sector. The gray column represents the evolution of jobs, growth or losses. Now, what you can see is that Switzerland, which is at the top, had value added over 20 years in the second sector, in the industry, of over 60%, with a productivity which was about the same, a raise in the productivity, and no job losses in the industry, actually even a small growth. This is the same for Austria, almost the same for Germany, a bit less. Now, if you take the EU average, there is a growth in productivity and growth in the value added of the industry, but significant loss of job, over 10%. And if you take some selected European countries, France would be minus 25%, UK minus 30 and something, and Italy also minus 25%, roughly, despite gains of productivity. So these three countries, at least the German-speaking part of Europe, has managed to keep a very strong industrial sector. And again, despite pretty high costs. In our case, we have to add to the difficulties and the obstacles a very strong currency, which has been serving traditionally as a refuge. Basically, whenever there is a crisis in the world, we have to intervene on the exchange markets to keep the Swiss franc low compared to the euro. When the euro was introduced, the exchange rate was fixed at 160. So you had to pay 1 franc 60 to buy 1 euro. Today it is 110. So you can imagine that despite all these constraints, to maintain a competitive economy was not easy. And this explains the huge gains of productivity, because only through gains of productivity related to automation and also a skilled workforce, you could achieve to stay competitive. A third specificity. So we managed to keep a strong industrial sector despite obstacles like the strong currency and the high salaries. And our third specificity is that we have no industrial policy. There is no state industrial policy. The whole approach is bottom-up, with the role of the state being limited in creating the proper framework conditions so that our industry, our economy in general, but in this case, our industry can continue to grow. We are not supporting industries which cannot be competitive. The market forces are determining the survival, the gains, or the losses. And for that, we need to adapt. Can you change to the next one? There are only 3, so let's have them. Yes. One thing which I think is very important to keep in mind in this discussion about industry in the 21st century is that the distinction between industry and services is getting blurred. You can see the red line is the situation in 2019, the gray line, 2019, and the gray line is the situation in 2010, and it shows the evolution of manual work, so blue collars at the top, non-manual work, so you can say white collars at the bottom, and in between those jobs which are being both. Let me give you an example to explain to you the evolution of jobs in the industry. I know very well one small company producing metal parts of very high precision. And when I was 11 years old, I was working there on Saturday morning to get some pocket money. It was the repetitive work, the kind of thing you see in Charlie Chaplin's movies. Today, this department does not exist anymore. The 50 or so staff, mostly women, who were working there are not there anymore. This production process has been totally automatized. So now, instead of having small machines with one person doing the repetitive, boring job, you have big machines, and the people operating these machines are mostly technicians who need to be to know how to program. They are on their computer doing computer programming. So this is, let's say, the third category, non-manual, but some of them, they combine both skills. They know how to program, but they're also able to disassemble a 6-meter-long machine and reassemble it. Because when there is a problem, you need to look into it. So this is what we call mixed jobs. And I think that this is maybe the best skills you must have in the industry today, providing the services and the computer skills on the one hand, and on the other hand, continuing to understand the mechanics and to provide and to do the manual work. Can we move to the next one? So that's why this distinction between blue collars, white collar, industry services is getting blurred. Also, most industries today, they provide after-sales services, and you cannot really say, is it industry, is it services? So I think it's getting a bit blurred. Now, I would like to show you here which are the sectors, in our case, which made huge gains over the past 20 years, and which are those which did not manage to remain competitive. So the horizontal axis represent gains in jobs, and the vertical axis represent gains or losses in value added. So the pharma industry is by far the industry which profited the most over the past 20 years because it knew how to adapt. The gain in added value, in value added, is 350, and the gain in jobs is roughly 100. They doubled their capacity. Then you have actually our railway, railway production. We have some companies producing trams and trains. They did very well. Watchmaking should not be a surprise to you. Despite the competition from the smartwatch, they continue to do very well. And the other sector which has done pretty well is the food industry. Nestle is obviously a concept for you. Nestle for us is less agriculture and more industry. And then you have some who have less employees today, but who still are doing pretty fine, like a chemical industry, like metallurgy, like machine production. And those who at the same time lost in value added and lost jobs, the worst being the textile industry. Well, obviously the textile industry in Switzerland compared to places like Turkey or Asia becomes very difficult. However, the textile industry adapted very well because they are not selling so much clothes and garments and things like that, or textiles, as they did in the 19th century. Actually, in the 19th century, we were a powerhouse in the world of the textile industry. Today, we're not selling textiles, we're selling the machines producing textile. Ritter machine is very famous and very much present, by the way, in the Turkish textile industry. These figures reflect also in our export data, because obviously the value added is not realized only in the small market of Switzerland with 8.5 million consumers. It is realized in the world. So our exports have grown to the EU, our first export market, by 56%, to the US, our second export market, by 185% over 20 years, and to China, which has become our third market, by almost 900% in 20 years. Now, as I said, all this happened without an industrial policy. From time to time, there are discussions in our parliament, should we introduce an industrial policy? And the majority is always saying no. We have to leave the market forces oblige the companies to take the necessary measures and to adapt to the conditions of the market. The role of the state, on the other hand, is to provide framework conditions which are favorable to the companies. And I think we can make those framework conditions boil down to three issues. One of them is access to capital. By having a sound monetary policy, an independent national bank, which is involved to make sure that the framework monetary conditions allow for easy access to capital. I called my cousin yesterday to ask him what was the interest rate of his last lease. He leased one of these big 6 meters long machine. And he told me he just signed a contract last week. I think it's a lease of $500,000 over 3 years, and the interest rate is per year 0.8%. So these are very favorable conditions. Then the second is, and there is no really, this is not the state which is dictating what should be the interest rate. This is the market interest rate. The second is access to a skilled workforce. We have an education system which is, I think, unique in the world, whereby only 1/3 of the kids go to high school and university, and 2/3 are going through VET programs, so apprenticeship, meaning joining a company when you are 16 and spending your time roughly 80% in the company and 20% at school. The good thing for the students or the apprentices is that when you are 15 or 16, you already get a salary. Usually the first year salary is between $500 and $1,000. The second year salary between $1,000 and $1,500. And during your third year of apprenticeship, usually you are already productive enough to allow the company to make money. So you are getting a salary between $1,500 and $2,000. And then either the company can employ you or you can look for other opportunities on the market. But also after 3 years, if you have become, let's say, a mechanic, you can go to university, to a technical university, and become an engineer. And you combine both the practical knowledge of how to assemble and disassemble the machine, and then the theoretical knowledge of programming computing. These companies who are combining these forces are the most innovative in the world. And that explains why our industry has managed to maintain its competitivity. And also that explains why Switzerland, in terms of innovation, is #1 in the world in all rankings. I said access to the skilled workforce is the second. Access to capital, access to the skilled labor. And the third one is access to markets. So the role of the state is also to provide with the opportunities for our companies to do business easily in the world. And the instrument we are using for that is basically the instrument of the free trade agreements. We have a free trade agreement in force since 1972 with the European Union. Our relations with the European Union are complicated, but at least there is a free trade agreement, and it works as we see, because the EU is by far our largest trading partner, even though over the past 20 years, its position in our foreign trade has been reduced from 60% to about a bit less than 50%, combined with the rise of China. We are the only country with Iceland with a free trade agreement with China. And that may explain the figures I've shown you before, like this tremendous growth of trade with China. Until recently, we were one of the few countries to have a trade surplus with China. We're selling to them more than we're buying from them. Now it's almost balanced. I think the last figure I have for 2019 is that we bought for 16 billion from them. We sold them for about 14 billion, something like that. So we have a small trade deficit. But access to markets is a key issue. And with Turkey, we have a modernized free trade agreement, which has been in force since the 1st of October. And I hope very much that this will also help to develop the relations between our two countries. And this is how I would like to end. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you are inspired. That's it.
We'd like to thank His Excellency for his excellent speech. Now, we are moving to our next panel. The title of our session is Central Bank of Turkey, Export Behavior and Firm Dynamics in Turkey. And our moderator is Associate Professor Bahar Elda from OSTİM Technical University. Dr. Aslıhan Atabek Demirhan, Senior Economist, the Central Bank of Turkey. Dr. Huzeyfe Torun, Deputy Executive Director, the Central Bank of Turkey. Dr. Altan Aldan, Economist, the Central Bank of Turkey. And Associate Professor Seyit Memin Calasun, Deputy Executive Director, the Central Bank of Turkey.
Açık mı? Açık mı şu an? Good morning. Welcome you all. Today, our third day of the Sepip conference, and we have a very special session. We have a very distinguished guest from the Central Bank of Turkey. As a former central banker, I will be very glad to host my friends here. The title of our session is the role of exportation on the catch-up performance of the Turkish manufacturing firms. We will look at the economic growth from the firm level. Firstly, I would like to introduce Dr. Aslan Atabek Demirhan. Dr. Demirhan graduated from the Middle East Technical University Statistics Department together with the minor degree in Industrial Engineering. She took her master's degree in Econometrics and Mathematical Economics from London School of Economics in 1994 and her PhD degree in Economics from the Middle East Technical University. She has been working at the Central Bank of Turkey for more than 20 years. She worked at different departments of the bank and seconded as an economist at the OECD. Currently, she is working as a senior economist at the Structural Economic Research Department of the bank, and she actively continues her research activities on firms' behavior and dynamics. Now the floor is yours, Dr. Atabek.
Evet.
Sol geriye sağ.
Tamam. Bunu açmam gerek var mı? Bunu mu? Okay, good morning to all. I'm going to take out the mask first. Okay. Good morning to all. Today, I'm going to present you my study, which is entitled as the role of exportation on the catch-up performance of Turkish manufacturing firms. Let me start with the outline of my presentation. My presentation will start with the brief motivation of the study, and then I'm going to present you the empirical model that I use. After introducing the data sets and the variables, I'm going to talk about the estimation results, and my presentation will end up with the concluding remarks. Let's start with the motivation of this study. As all we know, productivity measures the efficiency of the production process. And at micro level, productivity growth provides opportunity for economic growth and welfare increase, and plays an important role in determining the propensity of economy. Now, on the other hand, at micro level, productivity offers higher profits and more investment opportunities for firms. Therefore, it is crucial both at micro and macro levels. Due to its importance, there are growing literature on productivity, and the existing empirical studies shows us that there are a large and persistent productivity differences across cross-sectional units, such as firms, countries, and regions and sectors. And these observed differences shape the economic empirical research agenda for the last 2 decades. And among these concepts, the economic convergence takes a big room. And macroeconomists study extensively convergence of productivity between countries, regions, and industries. And during the last 20 years, with the increasing availability of the firm level data, the recent empirical literature starts to focus on firm level productivity differences. Now, before giving the model, I would like to give some in situ behind this empirical literature. As all we know, technology and innovations are the main source of productivity growth. And in this literature, the firms are divided into two groups. In numbers, there are few, but there are some firms that generate their own technologies. And in this literature, we call those firms as frontier. And the large portion of the remaining are called non-frontiers, and they benefit from the frontiers technologies through adaptation of the existing technology or either using the new technologies that frontiers generate. So in this literature, the adaptation of the existing technology is called catch-up effect, and the using of the new technologies is called learning effect. In more details, there are very few firms at global scale that are the most productive firms. Some examples are Apple, Google, Tesla are the examples of global frontier firms. These firms are generating the technology, new technologies. And through international trade, FDI, global value chain, or international mobility of the skilled labor, those newly generated technologies are transmitted by the national frontier firms to the national economy. And through spillover of new technologies, which we call it learning, or adaptation of the existing technology, which we call in this literature catch-up effect, those transmitted technologies are transmitted to the national non-frontier firms. And the productivity gains obtained from these technology transfers gather together to generate the national productivity growth of the country. When we turn our attention to Turkey, Turkey is an open developing economy that has been experiencing a remarkable transformation, especially with the help of structural reforms in economy for the last 2 decades. And she displayed impressive economic performance with 4.8% average annual growth, contrary to 1.7% annual growth for OECD countries during the 2000-2020 period. And this strong path leads the economy to promote from low to high income developing country league. And for Turkey, there are macro studies which shows us that the importance of significant contribution of productivity growth during the last 2 decades. And following the existing empirical literature, which use firm level data, the aim of this paper is to study productivity dynamics of Turkish manufacturing sector with firm level data. And the 2 main questions of this study is that whether there is a catch-up effect for Turkish manufacturing firms. And the second question is that does trade integration affect this catch-up performance of the firms? Now, I will introduce you the empirical model that I use in my study. The model, in this model, I followed the Griffith et al. 2006 study, and they propose an empirical model that enables to test the catch-up hypothesis of the firms to the technological frontier. And in their model, the labor productivity level of firm I at time t is characterized as a function of the lagged value of the productivity level and the technological frontier productivity level and other firm-specific factors. Rearranging the first equation that is presented in the slide, we get a new equation in growth terms. If we look at closely to this equation, the second term on the right-hand side, which is productivity growth of frontiers, corresponds to learning effect. And positively significant coefficient estimate for this variable implies the existence or learning effect from frontiers. And the third term, which captures the catch-up effect, and it measures the productivity gap with the frontiers. And again, positive and statistically significant coefficient estimate refers to the existence of catch-up effects for non-frontier firms. And in order, since we have a panel data model, in order to control for firm heterogeneity, all models are estimated with fixed effects. And now I would like to talk about a little bit about the data and the variables. The firm level data used in these papers come from central bank company accounts statistics database to monitor sectoral developments and to provide comprehensive and periodic information. Central Bank of Turkey is producing company account statistics by compiling the financial tables of individual real sector enterprises from revenue administration, sector information from Turkstat, and credit data information from the Banks Association of Turkey Risk Center. The frequency of the data set is annual, and now it covers with the recent publish of the 2020, starting from 2009. And in our analysis, we only consider the manufacturing firms data for 2009-2019 period. And the main variable of interest is the productivity. And mainly due to the constraints in the data set, I prefer to use partial labor productivity as a measure of productivity. And in the definition of the frontier firms, I follow the OECD definition, and they define the frontiers of the national frontier as the firms that have the highest 10% productivity for each 3 digits and for each year. The control variables in the model for firm-specific control variables are the size dummies, export statute, profitability ratio, non-price competition power, which is defined as or proxied by the share of marketing advertisement spendings in total operation cost, R&D intensity, credit constraint, and time dummies in order to capture the macroeconomic developments. Before going into the estimation result, I would like to present you some descriptive statistics according to the productivity levels. And as you can see from the table, frontier firms are highly productive, large, profitable, and more competitive. And also they are more export-oriented firms. Now let's look at the estimation results. This is the baseline model, which only tries to validate the existence of catch-up and learning effects. And estimation results shows us that, first of all, the size, export statute, R&D intensity, non-price competition powers of the firms are effective on the productivity growth of the firms. Moreover, our main of interest, we observed statistically significant and positive estimates for the frontier's productivity growth, which we refer learning effect, and gap measure, which we refer catch-up effect. This implies that in Turkish manufacturing firms, the learning effect and convergence to the frontier is valid. And in order to observe the effects evaluation over time, recursive estimation for 3 periods are done. And the estimation results imply steady convergence speed towards sectoral frontier firms. However, the learning from national frontiers seems to be accelerating since 2014. And the second research question, does trade integration stimulate convergence to the frontier? The corresponding model shows us that trade integration accelerates the convergence towards the frontier. However, internationally integrated firms' ability to learn from sectoral frontiers does not matter because the estimated coefficient is non-significant. But although it is not significant, we obtain a negative sign for the estimated coefficient. So this may imply learning from sectoral frontiers is less than the domestic counterparts. As a last, I would like to make some concluding remarks. In this paper, the process of catch-up at firm level is investigated. Focusing on Turkey, the process is evaluated with respect to sectoral frontiers. And frontier firms are found to be larger, more export-oriented, more profitable, and more non-price competitive. And non-frontier benefit from sectoral frontiers both through learning and catch-up effect channels, while convergence speed observed to be steady over the observation periods. Manufacturing firms' productivity gains from sectoral frontiers through learning has been accelerated since 2014. And exposure to international markets speeds up convergence of non-frontier firms toward sector frontier. However, exportation does not generate any significant difference in the firm's ability to absorb knowledge from sectoral frontiers, which can be referred to the fact that exporting firms prefer to learn from their customers or their international partners instead of national frontiers. Thanks you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Demirhan. Is there any questions? No question? Thank you. Now I'm going to present our second guest, Dr. Huzeyfe Torun. He is the director of the Structural Economic Research Department of the Central Bank of Turkey. Dr. Torun completed both economics and political sciences and international relations majors at Boğaziçi University. He subsequently received his MA and PhD degrees economics at the University of Virginia. Dr. Torun's research interests are in labor economics, international trade, and applied economics. His research primarily focuses on understanding the role of institutions and government policies in labor market outcomes of the individuals and firms. His secondary focus revolves around the impact of government policies on trade performance of firms. Dr. Torun is a co-editor of the Central Bank Review and an affiliate of Global Labor Organization. The floor is yours, Dr. Torun.
So, hello, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm Huzeyfe Torun, again from the Central Bank of Turkey. Today, I'm going to present a joint paper with my colleagues from the Central Bank, Kumaş Akdoğan and Kenan Bağır. And the title is Heterogeneous Effect of Exchange Rates on Firms' Export, Role of Labor Intensity. This is not a paper about the relation between exchange rates and exports. Rather, it's a paper about the role of the labor intensity in this relation. So let me start with some overall literature findings. So much of the literature so far basically tells that there is a sort of positive effect between the exchange rates depreciation and export performance of firms on the global case, but it's not always that strong, and it depends on the country cases. In the Turkish case, for example, when you look at the relationship between exchange rates and the export performances, colleagues from our bank claim that the effect of the exchange rates is quite limited, but the foreign demand is the actual determinant of exports in the country. But still, there are other findings regarding the effect of exchange rates on exports. And it depends on the structure of the production. It depends on the country cases. For example, when it comes to exporting to developed countries, it's basically the foreign demand what determines the exports. When it comes to developing countries, it's perhaps the exchange rate that is effective in performing in exports. And our paper is another refinement of this literature. So in this paper, basically, we are going to investigate another breakdown of the exports depending on the production structure. And more formally in the paper, we investigate whether the labor intensity of production has an influence on the relationship between exchange rates and exports. Again, we are going to focus on the role of labor intensity in the relationship between exchange rates and exports. And in particular, we ask whether the depreciation of the real exchange rate increases the exports of labor-intensive firms more than others. And let me move to potential channels for such an idea. So why do we think that labor intensity may have a role in this relationship? And we are going to list three major potential channels here. The first one is adjustment cost of capacity expansion. Say the depreciation of the exchange rate has an effect on exports. That's an assumption for now. If it has an effect on exports, positive effects on exports, then for a firm with high labor intensity and for a firm with low labor intensity, the situation may differ. After a currency depreciation, it's relatively easier to raise the number of employees or the number of working hours compared to constructing new plants or installing new machines. If you see an opportunity in the export market, but if you are capital intensive, it may not be that easy to expand your production, to build new plants and expand your capacity. But if you are labor intensive, it may be a little bit easier to hire new people and if necessary to let them go after the specific period. That's one reason. The second one is the persistence of the currency shocks. So when there's a currency shock, say there's a depreciation in the exchange rate, as a firm, you do not know whether the currency depreciation is going to continue or not. So there is uncertainty. If you are capital intensive, you may not think that it's worth to expand your plants and manufacturing platforms because you don't know about the persistence. But if you are labor intensive, still it may be profitable to hire new people to take the advantage of new export conditions if there is any. And the last item here is a kind of definitional. Here we say lower ratio of intermediate goods. In the coming slides, we are going to make a differentiation between labor intensive firms, non-labor intensive firms. If you are a labor intensive firm, by definition, your intermediate goods share in your total production is lower. If your raw material intermediate goods in the production process is lower, the exchange rate doesn't hurt you from the raw material or intermediate good channel. So your advantage may be higher than capital intensive ones from that perspective. Now the data, so this is an empirical work and we use firm level data. The data comes from the Entrepreneur Information System of the Ministry of Industry and Technology. This is an extensive firm level data on the manufacturing sector of Turkey. The EIS is a nice data set because it brings together confidential administrative data sets from multiple sources and make it possible to link the separate data sets through unique firm identifiers. The data are available for the period from 2006 to 2018 in this paper, and it excludes the public sector. In all our analyses, we are going to restrict our sample to manufacturing firms with at least one registered employee. If you are a firm with no employee, you are not in our sample. And we are going to focus on the period that the firm level data is available. At the end of the day, we cover a period between 2006 and 2018. We have more than 1.2 million firm year observations in our sample, and almost 1/6 of them have positive export value in our sample. So again, some more details on the data. So the data has Social Security Administration records, and we use Social Security Administration records in the data to calculate firm level employee numbers and labor costs. Again, we are going to refer to labor intensity and labor share very often. The labor share calculation mostly relies on the Social Security Administration records in the data. Basically, to calculate the annual total gross wages, we sum the reported wage costs for the 4 months and multiply it by 3. We further multiply the annual total gross wages by 1.17 to account for the employer share of the Social Security contribution. So the one important part is Social Security Administration data. The second one is the balance sheet, income statement of all legal and real entities. And we take the firm level total sales from the balance sheet data of the EIS. Then the entire customs data at transaction level to calculate the firm level export market indicators. We use the customs data. We can calculate the firm level product and destination variety. Finally, we use central bank data for getting the real effective exchange rate values for the period of time that we are focusing on. This is a basic summary statistics table. Again, annually, we have around 100,000 firms in the data. In total, it's 1.2 million firm year observations. On average, if a firm is exporting, the export value for the average firm is between $3.3 billion and $4 million, depending on the year. On average, again, number of employees of the firms is 31. And the labor intensity seems to be around 13% in the sample. So let's switch to methodology. Again, we are going to make a differentiation between labor-intensive firms and non-labor intensive firms. For that reason, we calculate a labor intensity. And how do we calculate it? So at the top, we see the labor cost of the firm for a specific year, say it's 2006. Then we know the net sales of the firm for the same year. So we have a labor share in the sales for 2006 year. Then we calculate the same ratio for each year between 2006 and 2018 and take the average. And again, if you remember the summary statistics, on average, the labor cost to total sales ratio is around 13%. So it depends on the firm. It's going to vary between 0.10 to 0.25, 0.30. So if a firm has 40% labor share, possibly it's going to be labor intensive. If a firm has 0.05 labor share, then it's non-labor intensive in our understanding. But we do it in a more detailed way. For each 4-digit specific industry, we divide the firms into 2. If you are at the upper half, you are labor intensive in that industry. If you're at the bottom half, you are non-labor intensive. So for each industry, half of the firms are grouped as labor intensive and the other half are not labor intensive. So the empirical methodology is based on comparing the export performance of firms that are more labor intensive with the firms that are less labor intensive during a change in the exchange rate. Again, exchange rate change is already there. We are looking at the difference between labor intensive and non-labor intensive ones. And this is just a example. It's not the real numbers, but here's the story. So there's a change in the real exchange rate, say in 2018 or 2011, there's a change, or over a 3-month period. And 10% change in the real effective exchange rate, it goes down, the domestic currency depreciates. Then there are 2 firms. Firm A, the labor share is 5%. Firm B, the labor share is 55%. At the end of the day, if we observe such a pattern, not labor intensive increases its exports with a small amount, but if the labor intensive increases its exports with a higher amount, and we have lots of observations like that, then we are going to conclude that a 10% decline in the real effective exchange rate increases the exports among labor intensive firms more relative to the less labor intensive firms. That's the basic mechanism. We are going to have thousands of firms, but it's going to depend on this mentality. More formally, this is our econometrics empirical specification. So here, the Y at the left-hand side, on the left-hand side is our outcome variable, the annual growth rate of export indicator of firm I in region R in sector J and year T. It's gonna be either export value change, it's gonna be export status, it's gonna be variety increase, it's gonna be destination increase, but it's gonna be some outcome related to exports. Then we have the log level of leg firm employment and controls for the firm size. We are going to focus on this beta 1 coefficient, the interaction between labor intensity and the real effective exchange rate. We have industry fixed effects, we have region fixed effects, we have clearly time fixed effects. And these are the outcomes. We are going to look at the extensive margin. What do we mean by the extensive margin? Whether the firm exports or not in a specific year. Then we are going to look at the annual change in export value, annual change in the number of product variety, and annual change in the number of export markets, defined as the total number of product country combinations. So when we say export markets, we mean product country intersection. So bicycle, Netherlands, bicycle, Germany, some food item, Netherlands, some food item, Germany. They're all 4 different markets in our definition. And finally, we look at the weighted mean of prices of products exported by a firm. So let me skip this one. This is to calculate the weighted price of a firm in the export markets. Basically, we look at the prices in each product and take the average of those products for a specific firm. At the end of the day, we generate a firm level export price calculated relying on the product level prices. So the results, it's going to be 2 compact tables. I tried to combine all in the first table and the second table. So these are the main results. This is the baseline specification with no additions. This is the specification that we saw plus industry year fixed effects. This is our preferred specification, which is this specification plus industry year fixed effects plus region year fixed effects, which is more refined, and we rely on this specification more than others. So again, this is our outcome of interest. What happens to export probability, the extensive margin? If the exchange rate goes down, the labor intensive ones are hurt more than, or goes up, the labor intensive ones are hurt more than others. Or the other way around, if the exchange rate depreciates, labor intensive firms are more likely to export compared to non-labor intensive firms. The second panel, if the exchange rate depreciates, a labor intensive firm is more likely to export and increase its exports compared to non-labor intensive firms. And more formally, a 10% decline in exchange rate increases the exports of labor-intensive firms by 2.6% more compared to non-labor intensive firms. What about product variety? Again, when there is an exchange rate change, if the exchange rate depreciates, it seems like labor-intensive firms are benefiting more in terms of the product variety in the export markets. And it seems that they're also benefiting more in terms of their market variety. When there's a depreciation. And finally, we do not have any statistically significant effect on the price of firms in the export market. This is not a surprise, as the Turkish firms are usually price takers in the global market. Let me say a couple words about the last column. Now we restrict our sample to relatively larger firms with employees greater than 10. The results are not changing dramatically. Most of them are still statistically significant. Actually, all are still statistically significant. Just the numbers change slightly. So it seems that the results are not driven by the small firms themselves. These are the robustness checks. We do many of them. This is our baseline specification, the third column here. Now, we use alternative time period between 2006 to 2008, a relatively narrow period, and the results hold. Then we use a different labor intensity we take the ratio of number of employees to the total fixed assets and use it as a labor intensity indicator. The results are not changing significantly. We use the nominal exchange rate instead of real effective exchange rate. The results are the same in terms of their quality. Then we cluster at different levels. The results are not changing. We restrict our sample to the firms that have relatively large exports greater than at least $1,000 to keep the sample more clean. And again, the results are robust to that choice of specification as well. So the bottom line of the paper, again, is not the relationship between exchange rates and the exports. That's not our focus. Our focus is how labor intensity plays a role in the influence of exchange rate on export performance. And in our findings, we see that labor intensive firms are responding to the exchange rate changes more quickly, more significantly than the firms that are less labor intensive. And again, it may be about the adjustment costs for labor intensive firms. It's easier. It may be about the certainty of the real exchange rate change. When there's uncertainty, capital intensive operations are harder to carry out. And it may be because the labor intensive firms by definition have less raw material that may be also affected by the exchange rate. So thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, I can happily answer. Yeah. Sure, I can. These are all OLS with different specifications. In part of them, it's the linear probability model. In other parts, it's the standard OLS regressions with fixed effects. You can call them as fixed effect regression or OLS standard regressions with fixed effects, but basically they're OLS. Was that your question? Yep.
And random effects. And then to find the appropriate one, which is the appropriate one for the panel that you are using, fixed or random. So sometimes we need to test if fixed effects is an appropriate method or not.
Again, you can call it as a fixed effect panel regression since we have 13 years of data and the firms, we can follow them across years. Mm-hmm. We didn't try random effects regression. We can, but I mean, my intuition, I don't think it's going to matter in terms of the quality and the quantity of the results. Mm-hmm. But this you can call a panel effect regression. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your presentation because of being late. But at the end, I saw some results of the regression. I just want to ask you that did you employ your model to the manufacturing industry as a whole? Because it is expected that the labor costs in terms of Turkish lira. So any depreciation in the real exchange rate makes cheaper the real cost of the labor. So did you have a chance to to this point of view? Thank you.
I actually caught part of the dialogue, but I missed part of it. So what was your first mention? The results are?
Did you employ your model to manufacturing industry as a whole? Because in whole, although you pointed out that we didn't measure the effect of the real exchange rate against the labor cost, but it is expected that the labor cost intensive, the labor intensive industries has a big labor cost in terms of Turkish lira. So any depreciation makes it cheaper.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So again, this is focusing on the manufacturing industry as a whole, that's for sure, but it's a firm level regression, just to make it clear. Second, yes, since the labor cost gets cheaper, when not cheaper, but relatively cheaper when there's depreciation in the exchange rate, that's why I think partially we are finding more positive effects on labor intensive firms compared to non-labor intensive firms. If you are labor intensive, by definition, you have less raw material or less intermediate goods, which are potentially coming from abroad. As you just mentioned, then it's getting easier for you to take the advantage of low or lower exchange rate. But coming to your first idea, running a regression for the whole manufacturing sector, if that's what you meant, it would be quite hard because of the number of observations. We have 13 years here. If I'm understanding correctly, if we take all the firms to one observation and make the regression, then there are going to be like just 13 years of observations.
I mean the full regression,
Yeah. If we exclude the fixed effects from the regression, we are going to find similar interaction terms, but these are relatively more refined. If you have any sector-specific, time-specific shocks that may be contaminating your results, that's why we are including the fixed effects. But if we take out the fixed effects from the regression and run a more simple regression, then we would find, or we found actually, similar results for the interaction terms. Yes. Any other questions? Thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Torun, for your very detailed and informative presentation. Our third host is Dr. Altan. He is graduated from the Middle East Technical University with a bachelor's degree in economics. He received Master of Science degree in economics from the Middle East Technical University and MPhil degree in economics from Tinbergen Institute, University of Amsterdam. He holds PhD degree in economics from Hacettepe University. Dr. Altan works as an economics in the Structural Economic Research Department of the Central Bank of Turkey. Prior to his current position, he worked at the Research and Monetary Policy Department of the Central Bank. He also worked in the Human Development Team in the World Bank in Ankara office. His research interests are applied macroeconometrics and labor economics. And the floor is yours, Dr. Altan.
Well, thank you very much for giving the opportunity here to present our research. Today, I will talk about our research with Aslan Atabek Demirhan on the role of size or age in job creation using firm level data. So first, I will motivate our research, and I will briefly talk about empirical literature, and I will actually talk about some measurement issues that are discussed in the literature and estimation issues in depth. And I will briefly introduce our data, and then I will talk about our empirical results. Employment growth is a critical concern for all policymakers and the public, as you know. And then determining the sources of employment creation is a major concern for policymakers. And there is a public perception that small firms create most of the jobs, or job creation rate is higher among across small firms, not only in Turkey, but in other countries as well. So there is a large empirical literature about this issue, mostly for the US because of data availability. And actually earlier evidence supports this popular perception that small firms create more jobs. But in a seminal study of Davis, Haltewenger, and Schuh, which I will use the acronym DHS in 1996, highlights some statistical pitfalls and they argue that the results are not so strong. And then in another study in Haltewenger, Germany, and Miranda, which I will use the acronym HGM, they argue that actually it is not the size but the age that is the determinant of employment growth. So actually young firms create more jobs, and the relation between size and employment growth is not systematic once age is controlled for. And in this study, we follow the methodology of HGM and analyze employment growth across Turkish firms between 2009 and 2019, so in the post-financial turmoil period, and also we do not include the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. So we also investigate differences between manufacturing and services. So now I will talk a bit about literature, and I will introduce some discussions about measurement and interpretation. So some of them might be trivial for you for the time being, but there were some discussions on them in the previous years. So first of all, we should be clear about what we are talking about. So we must distinguish between net and gross job creation. So net job creation is just gross job creation minus job destruction. And also, when interpreting, you must differentiate between contribution to employment growth and job creation rate. Sometimes they are misused. So another, maybe again trivial issue is whole size distribution policy by DHS. What does it mean? It means that job creation or destruction of a certain size class is not simply equal to the difference in the level of employment, total employment in this size class between 2 years. Why? Because firms can cross across size class boundaries. So we should consider the employment contribution of these firms that transit between different size classes. Then the following question is, which is not that trivial, is that which size class should we attribute job creation or destruction? So which size class we should include the firms? One and the most popular one is using Bezier size classification, and it is used since 1970s, and most probably it is what we would first think. So if a firm in the previous year was small, we label it as small. But we can do the same thing, but use end-year size classification instead. But this is not used very much. Another way of classification is advocated by DHS again, and using average size, or they call it current size classification. Here we just average the employment of current and base year and classify firm according to that employment. And finally, there is a classification called dynamic classification. Actually, this is used by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States. Here, we do not classify firms in one size group. Instead, we attribute the job creation or loss to the size class to which the firm belongs at the moment of that job creation. So to give an example, suppose there are only two size classes, small and large, and suppose the threshold is 250. And assume a firm where employment grows from 200 and 290. Then in this dynamic classification, the first 50 from 2000 and 2050 is attributed to small size category, and the other 40 from 2050 and 2090 is attributed to large class. This is most probably the theoretical best classification, but in firm level analysis, it is difficult to use this classification because you have to have different, more than one observation for some firms, which complicates firm level analysis. Anyway, in the literature, these size categorizations were compared in the US and in the Europe in countries. And what is important is that classification by base year gives results that are most favorable to small firms. And in the end year, we have the opposite bias. On the other hand, average size classification and dynamic classification yield similar results. So in the literature, mostly average size classification is used. So another issue is the regression to the mean fallacy. This happens because firms that recently experienced negative transitory shocks are more likely to grow faster, or vice versa. So even there is no structural relation, this effect will alone yield an inverse relationship between initial firm size and growth. So in macroeconomics, we call this effect the base effect. So if in the base there is a fall, then we would expect a significant rise in the next year. So this is why the DHS motivate and promote using average size classification. And the final issue is that in the earlier studies, firm age was not included in the analysis because of lack of data. But actually, young firms are generally small, so not controlling for age may yield biased results, as HJM say. So, considering Turkey, the literature is limited. Doğan et al. Provides a descriptive analysis of size and growth relation, but only for firms with more than 20 employees, so very restricted sample. There are two working papers that use the methodology of HM, JM, and similar to our study, Ateyas et al. And Özdağ and Polat. They analyze firm growth in Turkey for earlier periods, and they do not provide any sector level analysis. In our study, we also analyze sectoral differences. So the data comes from the Central Bank of Turkey firm level data, originally from Ministry of Finance, and it includes firms which have to provide balance sheet and income statement data to the Ministry of Finance. But in our analysis, we use only manufacturing and business services sector. So we exclude services sectors like education, health, personal care, recreation activities from the data set. So we end up with an unbalanced panel for the period 2009 and 2019. So there are around 1.2 million firms in the data, and about 7 million observations in the data. So first I will give some variable descriptions. So following DHS, we define firm employment growth as the employment between year T and year T minus 1 divided by average employment, not the base year employment. So we do not divide it by employment at year T minus 1, but we take the average of employment between year T and T minus 1. So this our G measure lies between -2 and 2. So what is nice with this measure is that it allows us to include firm entries in the analysis as well. So so we create job creation, destruction, and net job creation rates, or net employment growth rates by age or size class. So job creation rate is the employment growth in firms that have positive employment growth, so positive G, divided by, again, average employment in that age class. So job destruction rate is the employment loss in contracting country firms divided by average employment, and net employment growth or net job creation rate is the difference between them. So after this descriptive analysis, we run firm level regressions. Again, we follow the methodology of HJM. We first regress growth rate with on size categories. So here J is size category, and beta J is the coefficient of this size category in comparison with the base category. So we include theta as sector fixed effects. So here we use 4-digit sector fixed effects, and we include time fixed effects as well. So we use the same, we run the same regressions for age, for K age groups. And finally, we include both age and size in the regressions. So first I will give some visual results about size heterogeneity and age heterogeneity on job creation and destruction rates. So here in the first graph, I provide size heterogeneity with respect to base year employment classification. So net employment rate, net employment growth is this yellow point, is our main variable of interest, but it is okay. I must hurry. Sorry. So in base, according to base year employment classification, we see that net employment growth is very high in small firms compared to others. But when we change classification based on average employment, here we do not see that small firm premium. Still, smaller firms grow a bit faster, but the difference is much smaller compared to this graph. Also, there are some differences between manufacturing and services, especially here in services. Larger firms also contribute to net employment growth more. When we look at heterogeneity with respect to age, here we see a more clearer picture. Here in this graph, we do not have entries because job creation and net employment growth rates are equals to 2 by definition. But here you see that in both services and manufacturing, employment creation rate is much higher in younger firms. So, as I said, contribution to employment growth and employment creation rate might be different. But okay, I will just skip this part. Yeah. So I will just come to the regression results. Here we have firm level regressions, and instead of giving a table, I provide coefficients with graphs. So the coefficients are with respect to the largest firms here, with firms higher than 500 employees. So here, if we use Bayesian classification, we see that small firms grow very fast compared to large firms. But some of it comes actually from not including age. So if we include age, then this effect somewhat lowers. But if we use current year definition, we see that the effect is much smaller. And if we control for age, actually it even becomes negative. So it means that small firms actually grow even slower. So I come to the results with age. Here we see a more clear picture, even if we control for size or not. Young firms grow faster. The pictures are similar for manufacturing and services, but the effect of size is a bit higher for manufacturing. And this is that.
Thank you very much. Do you have any questions? Thank you very much, Dr. Aldan. Do you have any questions? Okay, thank you. Our last and final guest is Associate Professor Seyit Mümin Giresun. He's an economist at the Structural Economic Research Department of the Central Bank of Turkey. He holds a PhD degree from the Middle East Technical University. He is the Managing Director of Central Bank Review and an affiliate of Economic Research Forum. His research interests are applied macroeconometrics, labor economics, development economics, and industrial economics. He is joining us with online.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Okay, welcome.
Thank you. So let me share my screen first. So first of all, I would like to say I'm really sorry for not being able to be there. And I would like to thank the organization committee for this great conference. Today, I'm going to present you our paper titled How Do Banks Propagate Economic Shocks? And it's a joint work with Yusuf Emre Akgündüz of Sabancı University, Özlem Dursun Deni from Goethe University, Frankfurt, and my colleagues from Central Bank, Yavuz Selim Hacı Hasanoğlu and Ibrahim Yarba. Well, COVID-19 begins as a health crisis, but it suddenly turns out to an economic crisis, and we observe significant drop in revenues. Here we see year-on-year change in industry revenues across time. But the interesting thing about COVID-19 is that its effect on the industries is not homogeneous. So we see different effects for different sectors, and particularly the sectors like bricks and mortar retailers type of industries, we observe really huge decline in revenues, but some sectors are less affected. Even some of them has positive increases in revenues. So what we observe in terms of COVID-19, its negative effect on the sectors was heterogeneous. So we just want to utilize this heterogeneity, and we would like to measure the bank's exposure to the shock. And how we did it, we focus on the ex-ante heterogeneity in the amount of short-term loans issued by the affected industries. So in this term, our main research questions are, did banks transmit the negative shock to the rest of the economy, and are firms affected through their banks? So a few words about literature. Our work is related with two strands of literatures. One is the transmission of negative shocks via banks. So there are some bank-located shock studies, interbank linkages of banks, and there are some studies focused on spillover of shocks across geographies. And the second strand of literature is the propagation of industrial level shocks. So they mainly focus on input-output linkages, but we fall in between those two strands of literature. We are particularly focused on industrial level shocks, but we are looking at how it propagates through the economy via banks. So we are somewhere in between those two literature. Let me say a few words about our empirical framework. So we use COVID-19 as an exogenous shock. As I mentioned, we would like to measure bank-specific exposure with ex-ante heterogeneity in the amount of short-term loans issued to affected industries. We employ difference in differences analysis. Well, I'm going to dive into details, but let me say a few words. If you are carrying out this sort of study, the main problem is it is really hard to disentangle demand and supply effects, but our rich data set enables us to control for this by adding firm time fixed effects in our model. So we use several sources of data. They're all administrative level data. The first one is for measuring the shock. So we use industry revenues coming from Turkish Statistical Institute. We also use credit card spending. It's coming from Interbank Card Center. In order to measure the impact on banks' loan supply, we use credit registry data provided by Central Bank of Republic of Turkey. It's a very rich data set. We have monthly bank firm level loan data there. We also use firm balance sheets and firm level annual employment. They are collected by Revenue Administration and Social Security Institute. And finally, we also check for firm-to-firm trade data, and it's collected by, once again, Revenue Administration. So how we measure industry level shocks? We just split the sectors into two, tradable sectors and non-tradable sectors. And for the tradable sectors, we use monthly revenue indexes at the NACE 2-digit industrial level, and we focus on year-on-year changes in domestic and export revenues. So basically what we did it for April and May, we compared the sector's revenues at 2019 with 2020. And for non-tradable sectors, we use daily credit card spending in 2,250 spending categories for all provinces. So these are spending categories, but the data center is calling them as sectors. But what is important here is we see them at the province level. And once again, we focus on year-on-year changes in monthly credit card spending. But at this time here, you can see we have province level variation in the data. So we can observe them at the province level. This map shows us how the credit card spending declined from 2019 April and May to 2020 April and May. So it's important to measure the bank level exposure. This is the equation that's how we measure the bank level exposure. So here This term indicates the pre-pandemic loan portfolio shares calculated in December 2019. So as the banks and the firms do not expect any sort of shock like COVID-19 at the end of 2019, we use this portfolio shares. What else? We have this exposure term, and it is the exposure of bank I to industry N. We divide this exposure into two, as I mentioned. For the tradable sectors, we focus on decline in domestic revenues and the decline in export revenues. And for the non-tradable sectors, our exposure variable is just a decline in the credit card spending in industry N and province P. This is our empirical methodology. As I mentioned, we employ difference in differences estimation method. We use the time period January 2019 to September 2020. We exclude March 2020 because the half of the March was the pre-COVID period and the second half was the post-COVID period. So in order not to contaminate our results, we just excluded March 2020. Our post period begins from April 2020. But this is the key issue, as I mentioned to you. To control for loan demand, we included firm times year-month fixed effects. So basically, when we do this, we are just focusing on the firms that are working with multiple banks. If a firm uses only one bank, then it just falls out from our sample. Well, using this term, what we are measuring is this. We are looking at a firm, it is, let's say, working with the two banks, and we compare the change in this firm's credits from highly exposed banks with respect to low exposed banks. So this fixed effect enables us to control for this demand sort of effect. We also hear bank times firm fixed effects, and all our standard errors are clustered at the bank times year-month level. So a few words about the sample. We focus on privately owned commercial banks. So we have like 27 banks. We exclude state-owned banks because their motivation particularly during the crisis are quite different. They would like to give credits because the governments would naturally adopt an expansionary policy. But we use these state-owned banks for other analysis. I'm going to come in a minute. As I mentioned, since we use firm times year-month fixed effects, we focus on the multi-bank firms in our sample. So this leaves us in total around 8 million monthly bank firm observations for our regressions. I like this graph. Here we divide the banks into two with high exposure. Some of them are high exposure banks and some of them are low exposure banks. And this is like a placebo test. You can think of it. For the pre-COVID period, we see parallel trend among those two, which is expected. But with the COVID period, their actions about giving loans are quite different. So we use this variation in our estimations actually. So this is our first set of main results. I would like you to look for the post times exposure variable. So this is our variable of interest, and we run this regression for total loans, for short-term loans, and for long-term loans as well. And we always find a statistically significant negative coefficient. So it means that high exposure leads to significant reduction in banks' loan supply. So we find that the effect of the COVID-19, although it hits some industries, spread out to economy. If you would like to quantify this finding, we can say that a 1 percentage point increase in a bank's exposure to the negative shock leads to a 6.64% reduction in the amount lent by the bank. We also run this regression by using an interaction term, which is the month fixed effect times our exposure variable. So we can see how this shock evolves throughout the time in months. And what we find is that negative shock leads to a significant reduction in banks' loan supply in each month from April to September 2020. So we add some heterogeneity to our regressions. We divide our sample into two. We have as I mentioned, the more affected industries from COVID-19 and less affected industries from COVID-19, and we run regressions. If the effect of COVID-19 was restricted only for more affected industries, we would like to find significant coefficients for more affected industries, but insignificant or small coefficients for less affected industries. But when you check out the results here, when you look at the columns 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6, when you compare them, the coefficients are quite similar to each other. So in a way, we can say that banks transmit the negative economic shocks that originated in one industry to another industry by a reduction in their loan supply. So we find that this shock propagates throughout the economy. We also control for firm size because the theory says that banks have strong relationship with larger firms. So if this is the case, we expect to observe smaller decline, smaller reduction in the loan supply to large firms. So when you look at the coefficients, the first column is for SMEs with employment less than 250 people. When you look at the coefficients from left to right, the coefficients are declining. So yeah, the impact of the shock is decreasing as the firm size increases. Well, this was the loan level analysis, but an interesting question here is that could firms avoid a reduction in their total loans by switching to less exposed banks? So in order to analyze this, we need to move from loan level analysis to firm level analysis and check whether firms that borrowed more from high exposure banks before the pandemic experienced a significant reduction in their total loans after the pandemic. We once again employ a difference in differences estimation framework, but our this time equations is at the firm level, so it's not at the loan level. As we are using the firm level estimation, we cannot control for firm times month year fixed effect, which I mentioned in our previous regression. But instead, in order to control for the demand side effect, here we included industry times, province times, year month fixed effect. So we are in a way controlling the demand, the evolution of demand for a fixed, for a let's say some industries located in provinces. So we are able to control for the demand with this setup. The time period is the same. It is beginning from January 2019 to September 2020. Our post period is once again the same. So as I mentioned to you, we have included industry province year month fixed effects. We have also included firm fixed effects. And here our standard errors are clustered at the firm level. The exposure variable here is this. Remember, in the previous one, it was at the bank level, but so now we are switching to firm level, and we simply have the exposure of firm J's to shock through its bank. Okay, so what we do is basically this. We are looking at the credit structure of the firm, and we know from which banks does this firm uses credit. So using this exposure to the banks, we use the weighted average for firm using this firm level, bank level exposure. And these are firm level results. First of all, what we find, this is important, firms could not switch to less exposed banks. To quantify it, a 1% increase in the exposure leads to an almost 4% drop in firms' total loans. We know that from the data, average exposure to the negative shock was 0.025. So this leads to, on average, a 10% reduction in the firm total loan. So it is important. Let me say a few words. These numbers are big, but they are somewhat smaller than our previous findings at the loan level. So in a way, firms can mitigate the negative effect of the shock, COVID-19 shock, but this mitigation is really small amount. And when you look at the fourth column, we see that the firms that are exposed to with higher exposure, let me say, are now working with the state of banks more after the COVID period. Okay, this is an important finding because now we are switching to government support through state of banks. Here, actually, we divide our sample into two. One of them, the firms that are working at the pre-COVID period with state-of banks, and the firms that are not working with state-owned banks. So we check for these two separate samples. And what we find is that when you compare the column 1 with column 5, so there is a significant difference among these two findings, which leads to a result that firms with an existing relationship with a state-owned bank experience a significant increase in the share of its loans from state-owned banks. So as a result, they had a significant less reduction in their total loans. So the public banks, the state-owned banks, work as a buffer, but it works as a buffer particularly with the banks with the firms that have pre-existing relationship with these public banks.
Okay.
I think to wrap up, we also divide our sample into as the before less and more affected industries and run regressions. Here we also see both types of industries experience a significant reduction in their loan supply. So not only more affected industries, but also less affected industries are affected from COVID-19. So the shock propagates throughout the economy. We also check for the firm size, and we find that here, when you move from, once again, left to right, the coefficients are declining and even become statistically insignificant. So we say that large firms could switch to other banks and avoid the reduction in their total loans. This is an interesting exercise. Shock might affect the firms not only through the financial relationship, but it may affect the firms through the industries that their suppliers or purchases are operating. So in order to control for this effect, so whether we have still observed any financial effect, we add this upstream exposure and downstream exposure variables to our model. And what we find is when you look at the post times bank exposure, we still find statistically significant and negative effects. So even after controlling for upside and upstream and downstream exposures, we have COVID-19 effect, which is spreading through the economy via bank channel. This is important. And finally, we also looked at the real economy effects, and we just run regressions. This time our dependent variables is firm sales. We use the quarterly balance sheet of the firms. And what we find is that higher exposure to the shock led to significant drop in firm sales. So to conclude, we find that negative shock affecting certain industries can be transmitted to the rest of the economy through banks. This is our main finding. And this highlights the fact that the economy is not only connected with them through upward and downward streams like input-output relationship, but they're also connected in the economy through financial intermediaries. What else we find, as I mentioned, large firms could avoid the shock by switching to less exposed banks. And finally, firms that had a relationship with a state-owned bank could elevate the shock by borrowing from state-owned banks. So thank you for listening. That is all I'm going to say.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gilas'ım, for your very informative presentation. Is there any questions? No? Thank you very much. I would like to thank all my special guests for their coming here and share their works with us. I thank you all.
We'd like to thank you all on behalf of OSTİM Technical University. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you.
And now we are heading towards our upcoming session. Mr. Suhrab Hajimatov, the resident deputy representative of UNDP, is online participating now. Sir, can you hear us?
Good morning. Yes, I hear you loud and clear.
Good morning, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So let me just... So can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. So Dear distinguished participants, dear professors and speakers, ladies and gentlemen, let me thank OSTİM Technical University for organizing Smart Economic Planning and Industrial Policy Conference, and to speak on behalf of the United Nations Development Program Office in Turkey. UNDP Turkey is proud for establishment of strategic and long-lasting partnership with the government of Turkey on achieving SDG and Agenda 2030. UNDP Turkey works with line ministries, national agencies, local municipalities, academia, and private sector on productivity-focused competitiveness and use of technology for industrial transformation, providing long-term solutions at sectoral and regional scales, which resulted in income generation and employment. Our ultimate goal is support in achieving structural transformation towards a sustainable and inclusive green growth. The increasing intensity of the global competition and ever-changing market requests and the global need for higher efficiency, lower cost, and mass personalization of products and services are some of the pervasive disruptive forces of change around the world that necessitate the manufacturing sector as well as other sectors to undergo a transformation. So let me open my presentation. Yes. So to ensure the structural transformation in the Turkish manufacturing industry, increasing productivity levels in SME has been targeted by the government and reflected in policy and strategy documents that are based on the Sustainable Development Goals 8, 9, and 12. Competitive productivity is one of the main objectives stated in the 11th National Development Plan as an important topic on the agenda of Turkish government. Besides improving productivity levels, particularly in SMEs, is also one of the strategic objectives of the Turkey's SME Strategy and Action Plan for the years of 2015 and 18. In the same vein, Turkey's Productivity Strategy and Action Plan for the year of 2015 and 18 pays a special attention to productivity levels in the SME in the manufacturing industry. Additionally, 2023 Industry and Technology Strategy approaches digital transformation as one of the main drivers of productivity policy to be followed up after achieving better productivity levels. As stated in these policy documents, the enterprises should strengthen their infrastructure and core capabilities on lean manufacturing, digitalization within the context of Industry 4.0, quality management, innovative product development, energy efficiency, etc., through some well-developed transformation programs and practice-based trainings in order to improve capabilities of technical staff, engineers, and mid-level managers. One of the effective solutions applied in many developed countries in the last 2 decades is to build well-designed training centers, so-called model factories, which include a real learning manufacturing environment, a real product, a real assembly line, real machines, real processes, and real operators, and specialized training programs based on the series of hands-on and step-by-step exercises to improve the manufacturing processes within the transformation context. The model factory can be defined as a tool that enables the operational excellence principles to be disseminated in a scalable way by using experiential learning techniques. Model factories intend to change the existing mentality structure of SMEs and make them use human resources, machine and equipment, raw materials, time, and energy resources in a most efficient way and increase their competitiveness through training and consultancy services regarding continuous improvement, lean production, digital transformation, etc. Through these business support services, model factories address productivity challenges of manufacturing industry and enable SMEs to become more efficient, to sustain their growth, and to be more competitive. And in the end, they will contribute with higher margins to economic growth so that they can absorb higher level of labor force as a result of expanded manufacturing base. UNDP Turkey and the Ministry of Industry and Technology have been collaborating since 2015 for the establishment of the model factories in Turkey. A feasible study was completed for the appropriate models of model factories in Turkey in the year of 2016 within the scope of Applied SME Capability Center project. Following the completion of the feasibility study, Ankara Chamber of Industry and Ankara Organized Industry Zone joined the model factory project, both as funding agencies and implementing partners, so that the first model factory was established in Ankara in the year of 2018. Following, the model factories have been adopted as a policy tool and incorporated into government investment plan, as well as key policy documents. Additional funding from international resources like German KfW and European Union have also been mobilized for the replication of other target provinces. Business support organizations like chambers of industry and commerce in these target provinces have also allocated their resources for the establishment of the model factories. Through these different funding mechanisms, 8 model factories have become operational in Ankara, Bursa, Konya, Kayseri, Izmir, Gaziantep, Mersin, and Adana, of which 7 of them have been established through UNDP and Ministry of Industry and Technology partnership. Although the initial investment were financed by government funding, this initiative has turned into successful public-private sector partnership, where chambers of industry have also allocated additional funding for the establishment and operationalization of model factories. Additionally, to disseminate model fabrica services in the manufacturing industry, financing support mechanism was put into place by COSGAP for companies that benefit from these services. Up to 70,000 Turkish lira is provided to SMEs that enroll in Model Fabrica Learn and Transform programs. Additionally, development agencies incentives have been formulated for the cluster of firms that are benefiting from Model Factories consultancy services. These incentives and support mechanisms not only have ensured the sustainability of model factories, but also have helped to increase the outreach of model factories. In the upcoming period, it is planned by government to extend the service lines of model factories and replicate model factories in other target provinces based on the lesson learned, best practices, and demand of those provinces. Ladies and gentlemen, increasing productivity significantly with no additional investment in the production process of manufacturing enterprises, Learn and Transform programs have been implemented in model factories to significantly improve the profit margins and business volumes of participating enterprises. Learn and Transform programs involve training and consulting to help manufacturing SMEs change their production perspectives in the framework of lean production principles and improved productivity. Designed to enable enterprises to internally scale up the gains with no additional investment and become sustainable, this program is implemented as model factories in a real production environment where there is freedom to make mistakes and takes the experimental learning practices based on the lean production to the premises of enterprises. The program thus takes the lead in launching lean production at enterprises and help them increase their profit margins, business volumes, and employment as well. It achieves visible high gains even in the initial stage of implementation, particularly at enterprises which, though having high potential, fail to efficiently use their resources, consequently suffer low capacity utilization. Participating enterprises are offered 4 to 6 months of consulting services at own premises then their project leaders take up active roles in all improvements in the actual work and the coaching from trainers and consultants. The program thereby gives the beneficiaries significant opportunities to achieve lean transformation and raise their own lean leaders. The first pilot of Learn Transform was completed in Ankara in the year of 2019, with the participation of 8 enterprises in various sectors. In a period of about 4 months, enterprises noticed that they could achieve high productivity through lean production competence gained under the program. Gains included productivity boost by almost doubling, cost reduction by up to 18%, improvement by up to 33% in timely deliveries, and enterprises solely improved machinery and equipment efficiency, OEE, by up to 40% and saved about 40% in production spaces. They also achieved gains by up to 45% in assembly line change and overtime work. In the second, third, and fourth Learn and Transform programs in Ankara Model Factory, similar gains were achieved and exemplary success stories emerged thanks to growing experience of experts, firms who believe of enterprises representative in transformation and use of correct methodology. Ankara Model Factory has now launched the 5th program. Until now, over 18 companies have benefited from Learn and Transform program in 8 model factories, and important gains have been achieved in participating companies: increase in capacity utilization rate, decrease in cycle time, increase in daily production quantity, increase in OEE, area saving in factory, reduction in handling rate, decrease in scrap quantity, decrease in waste rate, decrease in energy use, and etc. So, ladies and gentlemen, once again, I would like to stress that we are very proud to be part of this great initiative. As UNDP, we look forward to working with national partners to deep diving into SDG localization, digitalization, and girls in STEM. Thank you very much.
Sir, we would like to thank you so much for your participation and for your presentation. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we will have a 10 minutes of coffee break and then we will continue. Thank you.